Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought. All right, thanks for joining me. This is Levi Russell, and what I want to talk about today is the difference between the progressive and the conservative perspectives on welfare, and I want to take aim at specifically the universal basic income. And what I'm going to be using as the backdrop for this is two conversations between pretty high-profile figures and Ben Shapiro on his Sunday show. So I will link to both of those conversations in the show notes. And the two people who spoke with Ben Shapiro were Tucker Carlson just a few months ago and Andrew Yang. And at least in the the circles that I run around in, the Tucker Carlson conversation was especially interesting in the sense that the Tucker Carlson at one point says that he would, if he were president, he would ban self-driving trucks because truck driving is, a relatively well-paid job for a lot of people that can support a family, and it's relatively low-skilled, and so it's just sort of a bread and butter type of job, and it really fits, I think, in a lot of the rhetoric that goes into discussions of factory jobs or just blue collar work in general. And so it's interesting that Tucker Carlson takes a certain perspective on technology and innovation and how we should deal with it from a political perspective, and with economics rolled into it, of course. And then a few months later, just recently, Ben Shapiro has another conversation with Andrew Yang, who is currently I think he's polling around 3% for the Democratic primary, but it's a big field already, even though it's only April of the year before the election. And so he's this entrepreneur kind of guy, has done really well for himself and has some interesting ideas that are, let's say, out of step with a lot of the more centrist Democrat candidates. And so his solution to this whole idea of innovation, putting people out of work, is his universal basic income. And so it's which he calls it the freedom dividend. It's $1,000 a month, sort of for anyone 18 and over, and it's got a bunch of different things where, if you're currently in some kind of a welfare program and you have to give up those benefits in order to get the freedom dividend. That's his proposal. And it's interesting the way he thinks about this technological innovation issue, in that he says, well, the innovation is inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. And it's much easier to simply admit that there's nothing we can do about it and just give people money to offset the negative effects of that innovation. So, I think he makes a good point in that if you look at it's a point Tucker brings up as well in his conversation, but Tucker just doesn't have the data to make the point. And I believe Yang's discussion was something like, there have been several million people have been put out of work due to innovation and trade. And a lot of these people aren't able to find work afterwards. They're not able to retrain, or there isn't training forthcoming quickly enough for them to swap over. And it makes me think of a movie that I got to see that hasn't been released yet, I don't think. Um, but it was a movie made by Arthur Brooks, who until very recently was the president of the American Enterprise Institute. He's a very dynamic speaker, entrepreneur kind of guy, and he's pretty interesting. The documentary is called The Pursuit, so I'll put a link to the main website for that in the show notes. What's interesting about him is, he wants to make the case for sort of free trade, free markets, and all that sort of thing, but he wants to do it in a way that responds to the way millennials and Zoomers are sort of not so enamored with capitalism or their perception of it, and they like socialism, or at least they like the idea of socialism that they have in their head. And what's interesting, one of the interesting things in his documentary is they talk to this family in Appalachia, in the hills, kind of in a mining and manufacturing area, in the eastern part of the U.S. And it's interesting. The man of the house is being interviewed, and he says, I'm 55 years old, and my job is gone because this new automation or trade. I can't remember which of the two was the cause for this particular guy, but he's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to go back to college? Am I supposed to go back to college where there's a bunch of 20-year-olds hanging around, or some kind of VOTEC training school? Again, he's 55. I mean, your brain just works differently when you're 55 than it did when you were 20. And so, this guy's prospects aren't that great. And so they're sort of on the dole, and, just, you kind of just see the depression in this guy's face. And, at one point he just goes fishing, and so one of the things you might think is like, well, gosh, this guy's going fishing. Geez, it must be nice to, just live on the dole and just, go fishing. But it's like, that's despair. That's just utter despair. Just the point you get in your life where, you feel like a leech. This guy, I mean, he even says this kind of thing, he doesn't want to be on the dole. He wants to work, but he just doesn't have the ability to retrain. And so of course we always hear this from, the mainstream of the economics profession. This idea is like, well, there are no net losses of jobs for innovation. And it's like, okay, yeah, maybe no net losses of jobs in the long run, but in the short run. And, if we look at the incidence of this change, this innovation, or this trade liberalization, or whatever, there are people who get hurt from that. And just because they could be compensated in sort of the economic theory world for that, doesn't mean they will be. So just because, the cost of all these other products go down, 25 cents or whatever, who cares? That is not going to make up for the fact that this family has lost, a large chunk of their income, or maybe all of it. And so, given that there is some kind of factual basis for this, and I think even even the most staunch sort of proponent of, leave the government out of this kind of area person would have to admit that at least in the short run, there's something that needs to be done, and by whom or to what extent, obviously, is an open question. But I think just recognizing that there is a factual basis and a theoretical basis for this in economics, it's kind of interesting to see it. That is sort of a common starting point for Tucker and Andrew Yang in their conversations with Ben Shapiro. And so it's kind of funny how the two of these guys take this. And so I want to talk about two different things. So one is sort of a political perspective, and the other is sort of just a purely economically technical point. And so on the political side, it's kind of interesting that, we would say Andrew Yang is a progressive, right? We would look at his, his bevy of political points and political positions, and we would say, Andrew Yang is a progressive, and that position, progressivism, is often considered to be sort of antithetical to free markets and innovation and things like that. But what's interesting is he actually goes ahead and says, you know, I actually don't want to stifle innovation at all. I don't want laws against new technologies and things like this at all. And I think it makes such a good point that the point we're at right now, where we have these high profile candidates and high profile commentators like Tucker Carlson that are saying these things that are not sort of in the normal, sort of centrist liberal perspective paradigm, right? And so, making these kinds of points, a progressive saying, yes, we need more innovation and we shouldn't stop it. We should just redistribute at the federal level, $12,000 a year guaranteed income for everyone 18 and over. It's just so interesting to me. I mean, I don't think his plan is feasible, but wow, you really do see this melding of economic and social perspectives around progressivism with Andrew Yang. And so then Tucker, you would think in Yang and Tucker both being sort of disagreeing with Ben Shapiro on this issue, because Ben is kind of just giving you the quintessential sort of free market perspective that, well, the innovation's there, it's going to take care of it in the long run. There's no net job loss. Everybody's just fine. And so he's having to argue against that, against Tucker and Yang from that position in both cases. And Yang and Tucker, again, they have these different responses. And Tucker's, politically speaking, is very conservative. It's very, reactionary or traditionalist or whatever the word is you want to use. And his says more, his is more of a point about, just stop the technology. We don't necessarily need self-driving cars. And yeah, sure, it's going to make, even if it makes products cheaper and makes us all more efficient and this and that and the other, it's just simply not worth the loss that it brings when it puts so many people in these breadwinner type jobs out of work. It's just not worth it. And so it's kind of interesting to see these two very polar opposite kinds of perspectives, both opposed to, what I would call the sort of centrist liberal narrative that, that Ben Shapiro does a good job of presenting. And so that's the political perspective. And then I think the other side of it really comes off of something that Andrew Yang said that's more in the economic realm. So in other words, more about the sort of technical, how would these things shake out type of discussion. And what he says is, so he's sort of justifying his perspective on giving the UBI or starting this UBI program, this universal basic income, this freedom dividend, as a response to these innovations and how they displace people's income or put them out of work. And so, Ben Shapiro sort of brings up that Tucker Carlson says, well, let's just ban the trucks, and so Andrew Yang gets to talking about, truck driving and how it's important and this and that. And he says, I think it's harder to figure out how to stop the innovation than it is to just deal with the consequences on the back end. So it's harder to predict what innovation we need to squash relative to trying to sort out who we should be compensating. And I think that's, to me, that's where I would really part ways with Yang. I mean, the UBI, I'm not really all that hot on either, but I just think this is just silly. It's not about predicting which types of technology are going to need to be prohibited. The point is that once you see something like this coming down the pike, you just have to respond to it. And trying to determine exactly how much all of these different people that might be hurt, either directly or indirectly, from some kind of an innovation, um, just doesn't. It just doesn't seem possible to me. I think that's just it's a much harder thing to do economically, to figure out who precisely is hurt and how much they're hurt by something. And so, yeah, is this, squashing innovation? Is that, does that slow down the increase in our standard of living? Does that, does that favor one group of people, namely sort of blue collar, and especially older folks who are going to have a harder time being retrained? Sure. But maybe that's worth it to avoid things like, this opioid crisis. And Andrew Yang makes a great point where he says that the opioid crisis is incredibly strong in those same areas where people were displaced by technological improvements. Their jobs were displaced by basically capital investment in some kind of new robot or something like that. And so it just, I think, comes down to sort of a cost benefit analysis and a sort of humility about what you think you can predict or what you think you can sort out in the sort of economic analysis. I just think these cost benefit analyses they're never going to be perfect, but we have to avoid saying that because the policy is not going to perfectly solve the problem it's intended to solve, and that there may be some unintended negative consequences, that doesn't mean that we can't take the risk or that we shouldn't take the risk. It just means we should be careful about it and we should be cognizant of it. And again, so this is, I think, very much where I think, Ben Shapiro's position is the wrong way to go. And then the other thing, again, is going back to this idea of trying to figure out how to predict or forecast changes in technology versus trying to figure out who exactly is hurt by these policies. I just think that's the wrong way to frame it. And I think that's where I would side more with Tucker on his solution. There are just some things we just don't need to do as human beings, in terms of innovation and stuff like that. And then this is all putting aside the idea that, maybe these self-driving trucks might not displace as many jobs as we think, just based on the way drivers actually work. I think a lot of people commenting on this stuff don't really understand truck driving because, the thing could drive itself, sure, but driving isn't the only thing trucks do. They deliver. So anyway, just a quick episode. And I just really wanted to kind of get this thing off of my chest about looking at these two guys who, in one framing are very similar. But then when you sort of dive into the specifics, I think you see that there's actually a pretty good sized gap there. And so with that, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. And I appreciate all of you listening.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.